Welcome, students. We're going to take some notes on early American society. We're going to look at religion, race, and reform. There's going to be two sections of notes within this section of notes. So let's begin. Early American society. The Great Awakening. Let's build some context. Puritan churches had become very legalistic and moralistic. They used the Bible merely for education. If you remember, New England was set up as a city on a hill to be an example to the rest of the world in Christianity. However, that became very moralistic and legalistic, meaning that there was little heart change. There was just demand of obedience without the change of heart. Many churches instituted halfway covenants. This allowed church attendance without experiencing conversion to address the criticism of harsh doctrine. The Puritans were known as very dogmatic in their doctrine, and so to address that, they allowed these halfway covenants where people were having a head knowledge of God without a heart experience of Christ. And so this would lead to setting the stage of a nationwide revival. Because if you have a dead church that's just moralistic and there's no life in it, there's no spirit in it, then people are left to kind of question their faith. And so the Great Awakening would address this. The outcome of the Great Awakening, this broke dependence on centrally organized religion by stressing personal accountability. So as we saw with the context in these Puritan churches, a lot of people just attended the Puritan churches just simply to be more religious and to have a social club. However, people are starting to now be personally accountable before God, starting to confess their sins and to have a heart change. This is also creating a lot of national unity in America. This is the first time that the Americans experience something as a whole and are called Americans by the British. And so there's this breaking dependence on the centrally organized church, the Church of England and Puritan churches. And people are starting to question for themselves. And so you have this independent thinking and this independent accountability before God that we see today. That when people are Christians, oftentimes they're very patriotic and questioning the government and such. And that idea starts to come about during the Great Awakening. People such as Jonathan Edwards and also George Whitefield, you don't need to write those down. Anything that is italicized, you don't need to write down. But they're going to exhort and urge for people to repent of their sins, to be personally accountable before God. So the Great Awakening is a pretty important event. We'll also have the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening is a religious revival from 1820 to 1840, creating new denominations, especially rejecting predestination. Predestination, if you remember, is a Calvinist doctrine that says that God chooses man. Anti-Calvinism is the belief that man chooses God. We see both in the Bible. So the nuance of who God is, he gets to have his cake and eat it too. And so I see both in the Bible. However, this movement was a backlash from the Calvinist doctrine. This resulted in millions of converts, especially African American. And this is where African American culture starts to be the gospel culture. Many churches preached end times philosophy. You'll have even groups such as the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons that will create exclusive groups that will preach an end times philosophy and focus on that. You don't need to write this down, but Mormons would move out west to Utah. This created a renewed interest in social reform. And so a lot of people will start to take their faith more seriously and bring that to the community. Instead of just their faith being a private thing, their faith will impact society. You don't need to write this down, but Charles Finney was the movement's founder in upstate New York. Looking at race, Lower South. The Lower South, cotton was the main crop, also sugar and rice. Eli Whitney's cotton gin expanded the need for slaves and land. When Eli Whitney created the cotton gin, that cotton engine would do the work of 100 slaves. And so now you needed more slaves to harvest and to pick and to plant the cotton so that the cotton gin can separate the seeds from the cotton. So in the Deep South, slavery was very much of a staple to their society. And so the Deep South was not going to get rid of their slaves very easily. It would take a civil war. Slavery was very profitable for them. But when you look at the Upper South, tobacco was the main crop. There were other crops, but tobacco being the main crop. And there was a weakening for the need of slaves. And so some in the Upper South actually sold their slaves to the Lower South because places like Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland wouldn't need as many slaves. And those states actually became border states, states that stayed loyal to the Union during the Civil War, and in large part is because they weren't as addicted to slavery as those lower southern places were. Field hands and house slaves. So within slavery, you will have two different types of experiences, geographically, but also within a single plantation. The field hands, those were the ones who experienced harsher conditions. They were called chattel because it rhymes with cattle. They were treated as such. The house slaves, however, had a better view of their master because they were not treated as harshly as the chattel, though their rights were taken away and they did not have respect as much, which alone is the reason that slavery is wrong. But the field hands would be ones that would revolt more against their master throughout American history. And so these two different perspectives would play out even today in society. You'll have some African Americans that are more conservative, that are not as vocal in protest. But then you'll have other African Americans that have experienced harsher conditions stemming back from this time period that will protest things like police brutality and injustice because they've experienced that more. Even the example of Martin Luther King Jr., who lived in the largest city in the South, Atlanta, and got a doctorate in theology, he would experience less brutality growing up than Malcolm X, say, would, who experienced a lot of brutality. And so you'll have different experiences that build different narratives. As you see right here, different leading churches throughout America. This is 50% or more in the county that identify as going to a particular church. Really makes sense that the Baptist is throughout here in the Bible Belt. And that's because a lot of African Americans during the Second Great Awakening will turn to Baptist theology. Down here you have quite a few Catholic, and that makes sense because of the influence of Mexico. But then up here you have Irish and Italian Catholic. Right here you have Latter-day Saint, known as Mormon, and that makes sense in Utah. Early American society, let's look at reform. This is the second part of our notes. Westward expansion, manifest destiny. That is a religious justification for taking land. Whenever somebody says, God made me do it, it invokes that idea of manifest destiny, and it's an attempt to get people to follow a certain policy. But we have to be very careful when we say God meant for something to happen. We can't speak for God. We can look in the Bible and see what he said about himself, but we have to be very careful when we speak for God. This manifest destiny was inspired by cotton for plantation space. As was mentioned before, the original motive for plantation space, this manifest destiny, due to the rapid pace of the cotton gin and that expansion and need for plantation space. Even the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act of the Seminole Indians, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, and the Cherokee would be forced out of Georgia due to more plantation space. Riches in gold and silver. When gold was discovered in 1849 in California, the Golden State Warriors, thousands headed west to make their fortunes. But it wasn't just gold in California, it was also silver in Nevada, known as the Silver State. Land and immigrant opportunities also present themselves. So as cotton and riches are a little bit more of the negative side of manifest destiny, as miners move out west and take land from Native Americans to seek gold and riches, and there's nothing to deter them. When Native Americans start to resist, And then the army is sent in to slaughter the Native Americans, blaming them for the atrocities, which really it was the miners who started it. But these land immigrant opportunities, with the rising tide of immigration in the East Coast, a lot of immigrants start moving out west. And the positive side is that it provides an opportunity for immigrants who are destitute of land to acquire land. But the sad thing is that this was Native American land that was stolen and then given to immigrants to purchase. And for many of them, through the Homestead Act, they would simply have to work it for 7 years and then it would be theirs. Mexican-American War. War would break out between America and Mexico due to the annexing of Texas. But this was controversial because annexing Texas meant spreading slavery. So you'll have people such as Abraham Lincoln that were very much against the Mexican-American War and the expansion of slavery, and also you'll have people like Henry David Thoreau that will resist paying taxes and later be sent to jail because he didn't want his taxes to fund the Mexican-American War. The Bear Flag Revolt. California becomes a U.S. territory as Mexicans in California start becoming frustrated with Mexico's president, Santa Anna. They request the help of U.S. military, and so the U.S. and Mexican coalition in California resists the Mexican army. And this becomes a cultural mixing of Asian, white, and Mexican culture as gold starts to be discovered. As you can see right here, the original bear flag was kind of a pathetic rendition of what would later be probably the best flag in the United States, in my opinion. Social challenges. Factories emerge. Low-skilled labor increases. As immigrants start coming to America, there's the availability of labor because of that. And so these factory systems start to acquire low-skill labor because you don't need a education to work in these factories. And families beforehand had worked on farms or on pea shops as artisans, and they would work together as a family. Everybody would have their part. But now with the factory system emerging, as we become more industrial, families start to split apart, and husbands will go to one factory and women to another factory. You don't need to write this down, but the Lowell system, young females lived at the factory they worked at. That is an example of the splitting apart of families that would happen, where your job becomes everything instead of family being everything. This leads to the idea of Republican motherhood. This is a backlash to the factory system, where the belief is that because the man the father is going off to work, that women should stay home as the moral guardians of the family life. And so this Republican motherhood would place all the burden of parenting on females, which is a tragedy because shepherding of children should be a joint effort, both male and female, if possible. The book To Kill a Mockingbird is a great example of a father who educates his daughter and shepherds her. And being a single dad, he has to do it by himself, which is heroic for single parents to parent by themselves. But if parents are together, it's quite a responsibility and opportunity to parent together. But you have scenes like this where it's pretty obvious that dad is more concerned with work and mom is into domestic chores, instead of it being a joint effort of humility, working together. Here's a map of different races. You have African American in the lower south there, you can see. Then you also have Mexican Hispanic in the southwest. Makes sense because Mexico is very close. And then you have German that moved to the Midwest. A lot of farms there to grow different crops, especially like wheat for beer, which is a German beverage. Italian and Irish you see over here in the cities, places like Boston, the Irish Boston Celtics, kind of makes sense. Social challenges. So as a wave of Irish and German immigration comes to America, there will be social challenges. Both the Irish and the German will struggle learning English, and so there will be a divide that happens in America. The Irish are coming over because of the potato famine. Germans are coming over because of political turmoil in their country. The Irish will settle mainly in the cities. The Irish will settle mainly in the Midwest country area. Nativism will develop, which is favoring the interests and culture of native-born inhabitants over those of immigrants. And so you will have this America First mentality that starts to emerge. This America First mentality is a nationalistic mentality, a patriotic mentality that has some positives to it, with preserving much of the democracy that has been founded here in America against anarchy brought from other countries. However, there's also a negative side to it that seeks to protect more of a white America and would later turn into the KKK, a terrorist organization that the U.S. government would seek to resist. The problem is that the Irish at this point were seen as a threat and unwelcome because they were oftentimes voting according to the Catholic Pope. Because most Irish were Roman Catholic, they would vote how the Catholic Pope would make them vote. And so there was that threat to democracy, so to speak. And that can be a legitimate threat, that when a religious group bands together, whether it's Christian, whether it's Catholic, whether it's Muslim, whatever group it is, they do influence elections. Instead of allowing freedom of conscience, there's this pressure from the church or from different religions to vote a certain way. And that was the case during this time period. Example right there of the Irish fear, the stereotypes. Temperance movement. The root word of temperance is temper, because there was a belief that drinking alcohol always made you lose your temper. The temperance movement sought to eliminate the consumption of alcohol. This was mainly led by females and employers. Employers did not want their employees arriving drunk to work or hungover. Females did not want their husbands coming home intoxicated and losing their temper, or not coming home at all. And so they saw alcohol as the problem of the home and workplace. But what's unfortunate with this is that it's masking the problem. The root problem is really the factory system and what's happening to men at this point. But alcohol is just simply the symptom. It's not the problem. It's just like a headache. If you have a headache, instead of masking the symptom with Tylenol or a temperance movement, instead, you should use water, drink water, or you should get rest. And the same thing with the temperance movement. It wasn't the alcohol. Alcohol is just a tool, but it's really the heart that needed to change, or the factory system that needed to change, and to address that. Abolition. Abolition is to abolish slavery. William Lloyd Garrison will be the first one to create a newspaper, The Liberator. Started a campaign against slavery in 1833. The American Anti-Slavery Society was founded the same year. Now, to understand how groundbreaking this was, how odd this was, how truly heroic the abolition movement was, is that they were seen as outsiders. They were seen as rocking the boat, because most people believed that a lot of people believed in America that slavery was wrong, but they really didn't want to do anything about it. Very similar to abortion. Many people in America don't like the idea of abortion. However, they're not going to go so far as to actually vote against it per se, because they feel like it's just too big of an issue, and the issue with a woman's right and such. And so the right of the baby gets ignored because of that. And so with the abolition movement, the slaves, their voice was being drowned out until the abolition movement was able to highlight the inhumanity of slavery. And by showing pictures of how bad slavery was to the North, it really let them see that slavery needed to end. And as disgusting as pictures of aborted babies is, that is kind of a similar example of this abolition movement. However, possibly the use of those graphic signs is not appropriate because you're trying to convey that a baby is a life and to show pictures of healthy babies instead of pictures of aborted babies. But nonetheless, both movements, the abolition movement during this time period and the anti-abortion movement of today, the pro-life movement, are both very controversial, and both have been met with a lot of violence and controversy. Some of the leaders would be Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, heroes of this era. Female suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. This sprang out of the abolition movement because both movements were seen as being oppressed by white men. The first convention would be in Seneca Falls, New York. You don't need to write that down. But you should write down the Declaration of Sentiments called for full female equality, including the right to vote. In history, the family would vote. It would be one vote, one family, one vote. But as the factory system starts to emerge and women start to be drawn apart from husbands and drawn apart from the patriarchal society, women start needing the right to vote and start becoming more individualistic. And so this movement came about at the right time, but it would take 50 to 70, about 60, actually about 50 more years. Yeah, 50 more years. It wasn't until 1920 that the 19th Amendment would be passed. Thank you for taking these notes.